All right, Broly and Invincible, episode 4. Broly returns. So let's get into it. The voice cut through the ringing in his ears, a sound that didn't belong in the hellscape of his memory. Broly's head snapped up, his wild, unfocused eyes locked onto the source. It was a girl, hovering just above the gravel, her form silhouetted by the distant city lights. Her costume was bright and pink, clean, a stark contrast to the grime and blood that caked him now. Adam Eve, who he recognized as Eve from his high school. The name surfaced from a boggy, distant part of his mind, a place of fluorescent halls and locker chatter that felt like it was 1,000 years gone. He'd seen her in the halls, a quiet, observant presence. He'd never spoken to her. He rarely spoke to anyone but Mark and Beats. Her question hung in the air, absurd in its simplicity. "Are you all right?" A dry, rattling sound escaped his throat, something between a cough and a bitter laugh. He looked down at his own hands, at the flaxen blood that dried under his fingernails, at the raw, split skin across his knuckles. He could still feel the screech of tearing metal, the brutal crunch of alien carapaces giving way. The silence of the red world was deafening. "I'm fine," he rasped, the words scraping out like gravel. His voice was hoarse, from disuse and from screams he couldn't even remember uttering. He pushed himself to his feet, his body protesting with a symphony of aches. He couldn't stand her gaze, the concern that was in it, the pity. It felt like a spotlight on a monster who was desperately trying to escape a cage. He took a clumsy, stumbling step back, his eyes darting away from hers, looking for an escape. "Just need some rest." And before she could form another question, another look at the unbearable sympathy, he crouched and launched himself into the night sky with a concussive thump. Poof! That scattered gravel across the rooftop. He left Adam Eve alone in the sudden quiet, a solitary figure with a head full of questions and the chilling certainty that that boy who had just fled was anything but fine. The knock on the Graysons' front door was unnervingly soft. A timid tap that was almost swallowed by the late-night hum of the suburbs. Debbie, who had been listlessly folding laundry in the living room, her mind a weary loop of worry for Mark and Nolan's unsettling calm, frowned. Who could that be in this hour? She approached the door, peering through the peephole. The porch light illuminated a tall, broad-shouldered figure, but his posture was all wrong. Broly stood hunched, his head bowed, shoulders slumped as if he was carrying the weight of a dead star. When she opened the door, the sight of him stole her breath. He was still in that strange, battle-scarred armor, now caked in what she desperately hoped was mud and rust. But it was his face that truly frightened her. His eyes, usually so guarded but steady, were hollow pits of exhaustion and a trauma so fresh it seemed to radiate from him like heat. He looked like a ghost who had forgotten how to be solid. "Broly?" she whispered, her mother's instincts overriding all surprise. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a monument to silent suffering, swaying slightly on his feet. That was all Debbie needed to see. Without a word, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, pulling him into a firm, grounding hug. He was stiff as a stone for a moment. Then a shudder ran through his massive frame, and he seemed to collapse into the embrace, his head bowing onto until his forehead rested against her shoulder. "Welcome back, honey," she murmured into the chest plate, her voice thick with emotion. "You're home now. You're safe." She gently guided him inside, away from the judging night. "Come on, let's get you settled. I'm going to make you some tea," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It wasn't an offer, it was a prescription. A cup of tea was the first step back to humanity. A small, warm anchor in the terrifying sea that he had just crossed. The creak of the stairs announced Mark and Amber's descent. Mark was mid-sentence, a light-hearted comment about the movie they just watched dying on his lips as his eyes scanned the living room and landed on the figure sitting at the kitchen table. For a full second, his brain refused to process it. Broly, here, hunched over a steaming mug of tea, his broad back to them, looking both immense and strangely small under the warm glow of the kitchen light. Broly? The name was a disbelieving gasp. Mark practically teleported across the room, skidding to a halt beside the table. Amber followed, her eyes wide with confusion. Broly, you're back. Are you alright? What happened? Where have you been? The questions tumbled out of Mark in a frantic rush. He wanted to hug his friend, but the rigid, haunted posture gave him pause. Broly finally looked up, and Mark felt a chill. This wasn't the Broly who had left. This version of his friend had seen things, and probably done things. I am functional, Broly rasped, his voice low. He glanced at Amber, then back at Mark, a silent question in his eyes. She's cool, man. She knows, Mark said, the lie, for Amber's benefit, coming automatically. He needed the story more than he needed to keep his secret right now. Broly took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on a swirling steam of his tea. After I went through the portal, it was this red world, the Flaxens. There were so many. I stopped seeing them as soldiers. They were just things in my way. He described it in a flat, detached monotone. The feeling of his control snapping, the green haze consuming his vision, the sensation of his power becoming a mindless, rampaging storm within him. Beach tried to teach me to control it. In training, I mean. I could manage it then, but in a real fight, with noise, the chaos, the rage just takes over. It's like I'm watching myself from inside of a cage. He spoke of the aftermath, the eerie silence, the sea of broken bodies and shattered war machines, the cold, sickening horror of realizing the sheer scale of the destruction he had wrought alone. When I came back to myself, I was just there, in the quiet. I found one of their portal devices still intact near a command center. I dismantled. I figured out how to activate it, but the journey back felt longer. A heavy silence filled the kitchen. Debbie had tears in her eyes, and Mark was pale, his mind reeling, trying to reconcile the gentle giant he knew with the force of nature that was being described to them. Amber, meanwhile, was staring at Mark, her face a mask of stunned realization. He had lied when he said she knows, he'd said. But she didn't, not until this very second. The story of an alien invasion, portals, and a berserker rage was the final impossible piece of a puzzle. Mark was invincible. She had seen this on TV. The knowledge hit her like a shocking physical blow, but she swallowed her shock. This wasn't the time. Her new boyfriend's best friend was clearly in crisis. Debbie broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. She placed a hand on Broly's shoulder. You listen to me, Broly. This is your home. You can stay here with us for as long as you need, for as long as you like. No questions asked. It was more than an offer. It was a sanctuary, declared in the warm, safe heart of a suburban kitchen, a stark contrast to the crimson hellscape he had just escaped. The guest room was a sanctuary of normalcy, flower-patterned wallpaper, a quiet hand made by Debbie's mother, the faint scent of lavender fabric softener, but for Broly, lying stiffly on the too soft mattress, it felt like a fragile illusion. The moment he closed his eyes, the comforting darkness curdled into a bruised twilight of the flaccid dimension. Sleep did not bring rest. It brought forth a high-definition hell of an action replay. In the nightmare, it wasn't a memory recalled, but a reliving. He wasn't watching from a cage this time. He was back in the driver's seat of his own berserker body. He felt the familiar volcanic heat erupt in his gut, the green fire that ignited behind his eyes until his vision was bleached into the monochrome of white rage. The sounds were not muffled by time. He heard the specific wet crunch of flaxen soldiers' skeletons giving way under his fists, the high-pitched shriek of tearing metal as he peeled back the hull of a tank like it was fruit skin. He saw his own hands writhed in emerald energy, moving with a speed and brutality that was not his own, reducing entire platoons to crimson mist and shattered chitin. The terror of the alien faces was not an abstract concept. It was palpable, sickening detail he had been too enraged to notice the first time. He tried to scream at himself to stop, to wrest back control, but the dream, Broly was a force of nature, deaf to the pleas of the consciousness that was trapped within. He awoke with a jolt. A strangled gasp caught in his throat. The room was silent and dark. He was drenched in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at his hands in the silver of the moonlight from the window, half expecting to see them still glowing, still stained. The guilt felt alien against his skin. The quilt felt alien against his skin. The nightmares had been more real than the waking world. A perfect, torturous recording of the monster that he had become. There would be no escape, not even in sleep. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed a soft, accusing red. 2:17 a.m. Broly's breath hitched. He had been asleep for less than an hour. The realization was a cold fist closing around his heart. The entire visceral slaughter he had just relived, the countless lives erased within his nightmare, had been compressed into a fraction of just 1 hour. How long would a real rampage last? Minutes? He sat up, the sheets clinging to his damp skin. The quiet of the house was profound. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the faint rustle of trees outside. Normal, peaceful sounds. He looked around the room at the framed landscape on the wall, the stack of Mark's old comics on the desk. Fragile teenager things. A cold logical dread began to seep through the fading adrenaline of the nightmare. The Flaxen world had been a military target. A hostile invasion. Its destruction, while horrifying, had a twisted logic to it. But what about the Earth? It was soft. It was cities made of glass and steel that could shatter like sugar. It was people, millions upon millions of them, living in houses just like this one, completely unaware that a living weapon was sleeping in their midst. He looked at his hands, clenching and unclenching them. The power had torn apart an alien army. The power that had torn apart an alien army was still there, coiled inside him like a sleeping serpent. Its trigger, a moment of panic, a surge of anger. Beats' training had been a dam against a lake. The Flaxen invasion proved that in a real storm, the dam didn't just leak. It vanished. He was a danger, not a potential one, but a clear and present one. The nightmare wasn't just a memory. It was a premonition. If he lost control here on this planet he had come to think of as his home, there would be no red barren wasteland left behind. There would be nothing but silence, and he would be the one who caused it. The weight of that truth was heavier than any kaiju he'd ever fought on Monster Island. He realized with terrifying clarity, the single greatest threat to everything that he loved. The night air was cool against Broly's skin, a small relief from the feverish sweat of his nightmare. He stepped onto the back porch intending to just breathe, to try and anchor himself in the real quiet world, but he wasn't alone. Omni-Man stood silhouetted against the moonlit lawn, his arms crossed, staring up at the stars. His arms crossed. He didn't turn as Broly approached, but his voice cut through the silence, calm and measured. Couldn't sleep either, huh? Broly stopped a few feet away, his own massive frame being suddenly clumsy and exposed next to the Viltrumite's poised stillness. He saw no point in lying. No, he admitted, the word rough. A nightmare. Nolan finally glanced at him, his expression unreadable in the dim light. About the Flaxen world. It wasn't a question, and Broly simply nodded, the images flashing behind his eyes again. He took a deep breath, the worlds he'd been wrestling with tumbling out. I think I need to go back to Monster Island. Nolan raised an eyebrow, a gesture of mild curiosity. Oh? I'm not safe here, Broly continued, his voice gaining a desperate edge. What if I lose control again? Not in a fight, but here, in the city. I could destroy everything. Everyone. He looked toward the house, toward the window of the room where Mark and Debbie slept. I can't put them in danger. I can't put anyone in danger. To his surprise, Omni-Man didn't offer an empty reassurance. He didn't try to convince him to stay. Instead, he gave him a slow, solemn nod. That, Nolan said, his voice dropping to a tone of grave respect, is a wise decision. It takes real strength to look at your own power and see the potential for harm, and it takes even greater courage to remove yourself to protect others. He stepped closer and placed a firm paternal hand on Broly's shoulder. The gesture felt weighty, approving. You're doing the right thing, son. Inwardly, Nolan's mind, though, was a fortress of code calculation. Perfect. The boy was isolating himself willingly. On that remote island, this unpredictable, immensely powerful variable could be contained. No more last-minute wild cards to complicate matters. No chance of him interfering with when the true Viltrumite agenda was enacted completely. He was a weapon being safely locked in a vault, and he had handed Nolan the key himself. This was far more efficient than any confrontation. Broly, mistaking the calculating approval for genuine respect, felt a tragic sense of validation. The greatest hero on Earth agreed with him. The path of exile wasn't just his own fear. It was the logical, noble choice. The first bell was about to ring, and the hallways of Reginald High were a chaotic river of students. Mark, having rushed through his morning routine after oversleeping, scanned the crowd fruitlessly. No Burley at his locker, not by the water fountain, and a knot of worry tightened in his stomach. He spotted Amber at her locker and hurried over. "Hey, have you seen Broly?" "He wasn't home this morning." Amber shook her head, her expression concerned. "No, I thought he was with you." Just then Adam Eve walked past, catching the tail end of their conversation. She paused. "Broly? I saw him about an hour ago. He was heading into the main office. He looked determined for some reason." "The office?" Mark's confusion deepened. Without another word, the three of them moved as one, cutting through the flow of students toward the administrative wing. They pushed through the double doors into the office just in time to see Miss Gable, the head secretary, filling a form into a cabinet. She looked up, her expression one of mild surprise at the trio's abrupt entrance. "Mark, can I help you?" "Yeah, we're looking for Broly," Mark said, his voice edged with anxiety. "Was he in here?" Mr. Gable sighed softly, a hint of regret in her eyes. "He was. He just finished processing his paperwork." She closed the filing cabinet with a definite thud. "I'm sorry, Mark. He's officially withdrawn. He dropped out." The words landed in the sterile office air with the weight of a tombstone. "Dropped out?" Mark repeated, the face feeling alien and impossible. "But why? What did he say?" "He didn't give a reason," Miss Gable said with an administrative shrug. "He just handed in the form, signed by a guardian, and left." Mark stared at the closed filing cabinet, his mind reeling. This wasn't just skipping class. This was Broly systematically severing another tie to his life here. The nightmare, the confession, the quiet resolution in the kitchen. It had all been leading to this. His best friend wasn't just leaving the house. He was trying to disappear. The final bell felt like a release and more like a starting pistol. Mark barely registered his classmates flooding toward the exit. His focus was singular, a cold dread having settled within his gut. He found Eve at her locker, her expression mirroring his own concern. "Yeah, he's not answering his phone. It just goes to voicemail," Mark said, the words tight. "Let's look," Eve replied simply. There was no need for further discussion. For 2 hours, they combed the city from above and below. They checked the old arcade that Broly had secretly loved sometimes, the park where they trained, even the quiet rooftop perches Broly favored when the world felt too loud. Eve used her connections to discreetly check bus and train stations. Nothing. It was as if the city, for all its millions of people and countless cameras, had simply swallowed the massive Saiyan whole. The rain started to fall, a cold drizzle that slicked the streets and blurred the city lights. Huddled under the awning of a closed bodega, Mark finally voiced the conclusion that had been circling in his mind like a vulture. "He's not here," Mark said, his voice flat with defeat. He looked at Eve, his eyes haunted. "There's only one place he'd go, where he thinks he's isolated, where no one would even look to find him." Eve's brow furrowed. "Where?" "Monster Island." The name hung between them in a mythical, terrifying place she only knew from Broly's fragmented stories that were told to her by Mark at the funeral. It made a terrible, tragic sense. A self-imposed exile to a land of kaiju, the only place his power couldn't be a cataclysm liability. Without hesitation, Mark pulled out his GDA-issued communicator, his thumb jamming the direct line to Cecil Stedman. It picked up after one ring. "Cecil," Mark said, not bothering with a greeting. "I need you to send me the coordinates for Monster Island right now." There was a pause on the other end, filled only with the faint hum of encrypted signals. Cecil's voice was carefully neutral when he replied, "Mark, that location is a classified high-threat environmental zone. It's not a place for a casual visit." "Explain." "It's Broly," Mark insisted, the rain dripping from his hair. "He dropped out. He's gone. I think he's gone back there, and I need to talk to him. He's He's not in a good place. Another pause, longer this time. Mark could almost hear the gears turning in Cecil's head, weighing the risk of a destabilized Broly on a remote island against the risk of a destabilized Invincible barging in. The coordinates are being sent to your device now, Invincible. But tread carefully. That island has a way of putting things in perspective. The communicator beeped, a map data stream appearing on the screen. Mark looked at the glowing dot in the middle of a vast, uncharted stretch of the ocean, then at Eve. I have to go, he said. Eve nodded, her face etched with worry. Good luck, Mark. The coordinates led to a seemingly empty stretch of ocean, but as Mark descended through the cloud layer, a massive landmass shimmered into view, cloaked by some kind of advanced refract technology. Monster Island wasn't just an island. It was a primordial continent, a jagged teeth of obsidian rock and jungle so dense and vibrantly green they seemed to swallow the light. The air that hit him as he breached the perimeter was thick, humid, and carried a cacophony of sounds he'd only heard in movies. Deep guttural bellows that vibrated in his chest, piercing shrieks from things with wingspans the size of small planes, and the constant unsettling rustle of a billion oversized leaves. He touched down on the perimeter of the jungle, the soft, spongy ground giving way under his boots. The smell was overwhelming, rotten vegetation, pungent, alien-like pollen, and the coppery tang of recent kills. It was a living, breathing entity, and it felt aggressively unwelcoming. Taking a determined breath, he pushed past a curtain of dripping, waxy leaves, the branches clawing at his suit. Broly, he called out, his voice swallowed by dense foliage. He had taken barely 3 steps when the jungle itself attacked. What he had mistaken for a tangled ancient tree trunk to his left uncoiled with the speed of a crackling whip. It wasn't a branch, but a thick, ropey vine covered in thorns like surgical needles. It lashed around his torso, squeezing with the force of an industrial piston, and yanked him from off his feet. Mark grunted in surprise and pain, the thorns digging into his reinforced suit. He was dragged through the air towards a gigantic, pulsating flower the color of bruised meat. Its center a gaping maw lined with rows of dripping, translucent-like teeth. The stench of digestive enzymes was suffocating. He struggled, prying at the vine, but 2 more snaked out, wrapping around his legs and another around his arm, immobilizing him. The maw loomed, ready to swallow him whole. In a surge of panic and raw strength, Mark roared, planting his free hand against the gnarled root and using all his Viltrumite-enhanced might. Get off of me! With a sickening wet tear, he ripped the entire man-eating plant from the earth, roots and all, hurling the shrieking, flailing mass of vegetation deep into the jungle, where it crashed through the canopy. He stood there, panting, covered in sticky, acidic sap. The reality of Broly's childhood crashed down on him then. This wasn't a playground, it was a crucible. And his friend had not only survived here, he had thrived. Mark stood panting, the acidic sap of the man-eating plant sizzling on his suit, the primal roars of the island a stark reminder of the world his friend had called home. The rustle of leaves behind him was deliberate and not predatory. He turned. Broly stood at the edge of the clearing, having emerged from the shadows without a sound. He wasn't in his armor, but simple rough-spun hides, with his hair longer and wilder, his frame even more densely packed with muscle. But it was his eyes that struck Mark, hollow, shadowed, and utterly weary. What are you doing here, Mark? Broly's voice was low, devoid of its usual quiet warmth, flat as a tombstone. I came to bring you home, man, Mark said, dropping forward, his own desperation cutting through his fatigue. You can't just drop out and disappear. We're worried about you, man. My mom, me, we're your family. A flicker of pain crossed Broly's face before it hardened. No. Broly, come on. You saw the news. You heard what I did. Broly's gaze was distant, locked on the memory only he could see. The Flaxens. It wasn't a fight. It was an eradication. I lost myself. There was just noise in my head. A green fire and then silence. A real world covered in pieces of what I'd broken. He finally looked at Mark and he saw raw fear in his eye. The raw fear in his eyes was terrifying. That was their world, an army. What happens here, Mark? What happens if it happens here, Mark? On Earth, in a city. He gestured around the violent but contained jungle. Here, if I lose control, I might level a mountain. There, I would level a school, a hospital, or your house. His voice dropped to a shattered whisper. The monster I became doesn't know the difference between a flaxen and your mother. I can't. I won't be the reason why you lose everything. My place is here, where my rage can only hurt the things that are already monsters. Mark stared at his friend, the plea dying on his lips. Broly's reasoning was a fortress built from trauma, and no simple words from him were going to breach its walls. The cacophony of the jungle seemed to amplify in the heavy silence between them, a living representation of the chaos that Broly feared living inside of him. Broly, you're not a monster, man, Mark insisted, his voice straining with emotion. What happened with the Flaxens was... It was a war. You saved us. You saved me. He took a step closer, his boots sinking into the soft, pungent earth. We can figure this out together. Beats trained you, right? So we could just level that up, man. We can find a way. The shrill digital ringtone of his GDA common communicator sliced through the primordial sounds of the island, a jarring, alien intrusion. Mark flinched, frustration flashing across his face. He nearly ignored it, but duty, a habit already digging his claws into him, made him tap the device on his wrist. Cecil Stedman's holographic face, grim and impatient, flickered to life. Invincible. Status update on your personal errand. Cecil's tone made it clear he considered this a distraction. Cecil. Now's not a great time, Mark began, his eyes still locked on Broly's impassive form. It never is. I have a priority assignment. Some astronauts are prepping to launch to Mars. They've requested a guardian escort as a precaution. Your father and I agree it would be a valuable low-stakes training for you. Get to the GDA orbital dock ASAP. The mention of his father, Nolan's approval, his planning was a psychological lever that Cecil knew how to pull. Mark's shoulders slumped in defeat. The larger machine of superheroics was demanding its cog back. He looked from Cecil's hologram to Broly, who stood like a statue already receding back into the wilderness. Fine. I'm on my way, Mark bit out, cutting the transmission. He turned back to Broly, his expression a mixture of apology and fierce determination. This isn't over, he vowed, pointing a finger at his friend. This conversation is just pause. I'm not just going to leave you here. And with one last look, Mark shot into the sky, leaving Broly alone in the clearing, the jungle already seeming to close in around him once more. The image of Broly vanishing into the night was seared into Adam Eve's memory. The haunted look in his eyes, the way he'd flinched at her concern. It was a stark contrast to the mindless berserker from the Flaxen invasion footage. That being had been a force of nature. The boy on the rooftop was a prisoner of his very own power. Now standing in the damp city air after Mark's rushed and frustrated departure, that image returned with renewed force. Mark had failed. His plea, born of years of friendship and shared history, had shattered against the fortress of Broly's own guilt. The logic was terrifyingly sound. If emotional anchors like Mark and Debbie couldn't reach him, what hope did anyone else have? Yet, as Eve watched Invincible's yellow and blue form shrink to a speck in the sky, a counterintuitive thought began to form. Maybe that's exactly why I should go. She and Broly were near strangers. They'd shared a school for years without exchanging more than a passing glance. There was no history, no weight of expectation, no complicated bond or brotherhood that should be weaponized by his guilt. To Broly, Mark was a living symbol of everything he could destroy. Eve was nobody, a neutral party, a clean slate. Her presence wouldn't be a plea from a loved one, which he clearly felt unworthy of. It could be an offer from one outsider to another. She knew what it was like to be different, to hold a power that defined you in the eyes of the world, but where her powers were about creation and control, his were about pure, uncontrollable destruction. He saw himself as a bomb, perhaps. Perhaps she could have the other perspective of an architect. It was a massive risk. He could be volatile, a raw nerve ending of trauma and power. Showing up uninvited on his isolated turf could trigger the very reaction that he feared. But the alternative of leaving him to fester in his self-loathing and isolation on an island of monsters felt like a guarantee for a future catastrophe. Someone had to try a different approach, to extend a hand without the baggage of a shared past. It was terrifying, perhaps a foolish notion. But as she turned her gaze from the empty sky toward the vast unseen ocean, Eve had made her decision. She was going to go to Monster Island to try to reason with Broly. Alright, man. Hope you guys liked that episode. Next episode will be out real soon, alright? I already got the script made. I just got to get the pictures done. So see you on the next one. Peace. Hit that like button and all that. Gone.